Oh, it is 8:30. Okay, people are coming. Can you see the attendees, or you see the questions and everything you said?
I don't see questions. I just see the attendees.
Okay, we're giving it a few more minutes so people join in. Whoa. Where's the questions? Morning, Ken. If everybody else, I know Ken's on. Hopefully you can hear. If everybody else can just tell me where they're located in the question box. Barry Parsippany. Barry, did you lose power last night? Livingston, Queens, Totowa. Alrighty. So apparently they can hear us, because normally some people will say, I can't hear you. Well, I have a whole list of people here who can hear me. So, all right, it's 8:31, so we'll get started. I want to welcome everybody that's here. Hopefully everybody else who comes on won't miss with what we're saying. I want to thank you. We're going to kind of deviate from the normal. We'll still with the sweater series, but we're going to deviate from the normal PPP and all the matters relating to forgiveness for now. But we're going to stick with the COVID mindset, and we're going with the topic today of the future for how to plan for a remote audit. So it seems like we're going to be working remotely in some capacity for some time being. I just heard last night, I don't know if you ladies heard, somebody said that they heard that we're going to be wearing masks for the next 6 years. Did you guys hear that? Yeah. So I wonder, do women have to wear less lipstick then if we're wearing more masks? Yeah?
Just more eye makeup. That's all we have to do. More eye makeup.
Because it highlights the eyes.
That's right. That's the only thing you can see.
Okay. People are learning stuff today. That's important. So today we are going to talk about how to prepare for remote audit, because what's happening now is a lot of firms, including Soboco, were having restrictions on when we can go out to clients, and the normal process of us coming out and sitting in your office for X amount of weeks is not going to happen that way. We may have to come out for a certain amount of work, but majority of the work is going to be done remotely. Now, I know that in our office have done what's called desk audits, where the clients mail us everything for years. So we're kind of used to doing it, but not in the capacity that we're going to be doing it now. So the topic today is for the future is now and how to plan for a remote audit. This is directed towards you, the participants, so that you get information on how to best facilitate the remote audit. Now, I want to say one thing. I'm looking at Aurora. I'll introduce my speakers in a second. Aurora also handles part of our outsourcing group. So when we use the word audit, we don't only mean literally audits. It could be audits, reviews, consulting, outsourcing services, any type of service where you normally think we're coming to your office and now we're not anymore. So audit is just a catch-all word. As you know, I have to do 4 polls, and you, if you're trying to get CPE, have to respond to at least 3 of those polls, 75%. I'm going to launch the first poll so you know what it looks like. And remember, if you can't run the poll, please minimize the screen, the poll, and then you'll be able to do it. So what percent of your people have returned to work? So as soon as I get up to around a minute or almost 90%, then we can close the poll, launch, share it, and then move on. So otherwise you have to sit here quietly. And poll's about to close, so we're at 75%. So right now, 40%, or I don't know if you guys can see the polls, 11% are at 0. 39% of the people say 20%. I know I'm giving you all percents now. A quarter of the people say 50% have returned. And can you believe almost a quarter of the people say 100% of their people have returned to work. Wow. Now, if we have supermarkets and stuff like that, or essential essential services, then I can understand. But I'm surprised that 125% say 100% have returned. I don't know if that means anything to your presentation, but that's why I start with a poll to see if I can give you any information. So the presenters today are two of our audit partners, and as I said, Aurora handles our part of our not core services, our CAS, client advisory services aspect. Aurora Rosado Rosario, she can give you a background as how long she's been there. I have a tough enough time saying her full name, but she is a partner on the A&A and client services side. Tara Delgavio is a senior manager in the audit department and handles mainly nonprofits. I don't know if you have any non-nonprofit clients, but Tara can also give you more of a background if I didn't share it enough. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Aurora and Tara. They know that I'll be interrupting them because that's just my nature. Aurora.
Hi, yeah, like Brad said, I'm a partner on the A&A side, but I also work with a lot of clients in the outsourcing side where we do outsource CFO work. So I know what it's like to be remote based on being the CPA and then being the client. So when we're going through some topics, I'm going to give kind of the dual perspective so people have more to relate to. Sarah.
So I'm a senior manager in the not-for-profit group in Sobel. I have over 20 years of experience in both not-for-profit and for-profit accounting and auditing. So I'm looking at it from that perspective. But for this presentation, we're mostly looking at our last 4-month window from that experience to give you whatever tips and pointers we can.
Great, thank you. And remember, you can ask your questions as I go along. I do look at the questions, and I will, try and ask them to the presenters as we go along. Try and keep the questions a little bit short. Some people recently have been typing books, and it's harder for me to read. And I'm going to be honest, if I see a book, I have to try and go to the next one. So please ask the questions as they go along. We want to try and keep this as interactive as it can be virtually. So with that point, the slides are yours, Aurora.
You can go to the next slide. So
Yeah.
we just wanted to give an overview. Here's the agenda and here's the topics we're going to cover. We're going to start with planning, then we're going to go to document review. We're going to go over the process of remote interviews. We're going to talk about any technical considerations when it comes to the professional standards and how an audit has to be conducted. And then we're going to wrap everything up with our concluding observations and then any Q&A at the end. We're welcome to any more questions you have. All right, and Tara's going to kick it off. So next slide.
Thanks again. Thanks for joining us today. So now we are 4 months in on remote auditing, and we have definitely learned some strategies to performing an effective audit. What we found is that planning, although it's always been a part of the audit process, whether it's remote or a regular audit, it's become more important, or rather we've had to focus on certain tenets of it for the remote atmosphere just in order to make everything work. For one thing, if the audit plan starts to need a change or we need to pivot, it's a lot more difficult to pivot remotely than it would be when you're in person because people are at different locations. So where in the past, if you decided I'm going to go down a different road, you could all just sit in a room and assign different or talk about, brainstorm how you were going to move forward, call the client in because they would just be in the next office. And it's just a lot easier. When you're doing it remotely, it requires getting everybody in different locations on the same page. And so it's just more effective if you have a well-planned audit. So the first tip, or really what's most essential, is that both parties, the auditor and the auditee, should have an understanding of the audit approach. How are we going to do this, right? Client, set expectations at the outset, right? Have deadlines moved. So what we saw at 415 and 515 is the deadlines that were in place for taxes and for certain filings moved to 715. Going forward, I'm not sure if we're going to see that kind of movement, but we may. So it's important to understand, have your deadlines changed. has the financial condition of the client changed? So meaning, is program revenue decreased? Is there no revenue coming in from certain sources? Have people at the organization been let go, or are you operating only at half speed? If you have loans on the books, it might be a good time, if your financial condition has changed, to reach out to your lender in terms of the timing of the audit, if you don't expect it to go off as it would in the past, or if you think that you may not be passing all your covenants. To reach out earlier rather than later will save you some time on the back end, especially since the remote audit can be a little bit more timely consuming than a regular audit. Although we have had a tremendous amount of success with meeting deadlines and getting our audits out the way that we have in the past. Another important point is how and well information will be exchanged. Are you going to exchange it via email or via a secure portal? The integrity and the privacy of the information is really important. So we have to make sure that whatever mode we select, it's the best selection for efficiency, as well as for meeting those goals of keeping it safe and keeping the data integrity. Another big discussion is what limitations will there be? Brad mentioned in the beginning, some of the audit may have to be performed in-house. And we're going to find that that is going to happen with certain audits. And if so, what are the arrangements? So I can give you an example. I do a lot of clients, or I service a lot of clients that have funds coming in from federal, state, and local sources. So the files that are concerning these grants and these grant amounts are huge. They can be 2-3 inches thick of paper. They're very paper driven. In this case, it's probably not most effective to start trying to do that remotely. It would cause undue stress not only on the client, but also on the auditor, because we do like to see the complete package. We want to know what communications have gone back and forth. Sometimes there's a bud mod in there that maybe a client isn't aware of. So what I think is important is that upfront you decide what parts of the audits can be done relatively well remotely, and that is most of the audit. But the parts that aren't going to be done remotely, how are we going to do them? And there's a couple of suggestions. In some cases, if the client has good protocols in place and the client has enough room at their place for social distancing, it's possible to send a person or two from the team in to actually accomplish that work on site at the client's place of business. There are some cases, however, where the client does not have the room to allow for social distancing, or they may not be comfortable having additional people come in and work with their staff. And in those cases, we've been very successful in being able to drop off information. So clients will ready a package that has original documentation, so they're not making copies, they're not scanning, and we actually come, we send a staff member or myself or whoever on the team will go get the package, sign off for it, sign off for the documents you're taking, take them to a remote location, audit as you would there, and then drop them back off. And we've been very successful with that. It's worked out well. So that is just another alternative of what can be done. Another point is that timelines should really be communicated in regard to the expected receipt of audit schedules and support, etc. So because the in-person connection is no longer there, it's easy to be out of sight and out of mind. So I've noticed this. We're not there, and sometimes a client isn't really even there at their place of business. So it's important to set goals and stick with them. If you start to fall off the deadline, everybody can congregate again, get together, and decide how you're going to get righted. But it will never come to completion, the audit, if it's not handled in the way that it was in the past, where these annoying auditors would come in twice an audit. Maybe in the morning we'd come in and say, hey, how you doing? I'm missing prepaid insurance. Or come in at the end of the day and do the same thing. That option is really not available in terms of in-person. So now we have to find a better way to still make those communications happen by utilizing either phone or screen sharing, video conferences. But we definitely should agree on timing and how those communications will occur. So Aurora, now that we've been auditing this way for 4 months,
I
And
have,
you,
I have a question for you real quick. You've said one word a couple times, and that's deadlines.
right.
Now, I work in part of an SEC world. I know that you work in a regulatory world. The one thing that I like about certain clients, I don't enjoy PCOB. I want to go on the record of saying that. I respect the PCOB. I don't like PCOB audits. It's not fun. All other audits are fun though. But the one thing I do like about SEC PCOB is there is a deadline. There's, you know, we or somebody may procrastinate up to that deadline, but there's a deadline. There's absolute closure. And I've noticed when people create solid deadlines, not these fictitious deadlines, Ron, and they really abide by them, things move much smoother. Do you see that?
I definitely agree with that. And that's why I think it's important to get everybody on board. And now I feel like Aurora, being that you see it from both sides, you see it from the client side and you see it from the auditor side. Is there any tips that you can add or to what I've already said that's going to make it easier or better?
I mean, I really think that communication is critical. And I think having a conversation up front before, we send out our checklist and all of our letters, I think it's really important because I've been surprised. Some of the clients that I thought were going to push back and say, no, you have to come in here. They've been the ones who've responded and said, no way, I'm not going in. We'll figure out how to get you the information. And then I have other clients who, when I talk to them, I'm like, do you have any sort of responsibility forms or anything you want us to follow as we enter your office if we have to pick documents up? It's conversations they may not have had themselves. And they're kind of like, well, what are you guys doing? So I think it's a really good opportunity, but I think the upfront conversation saves a lot of time because if not, we send all these things and they're confused and they don't know how to use this portal or that portal. So I think just talking up front before you start sending everything will really add to the efficiency.
So Nancy asked a question. She said, but in this, Aurora, I'd like to see what your perspective is on it since you've been on both sides. Who takes the lead? Who takes the lead in planning the conversation, the auditor or Ed? Now, I imagine Ed is executive director and not every client has an Ed.
So one client I'm the outsourced CFO for, because I have the auditor background, I've taken the lead because the client doesn't really have the knowledge of how to make sure that we're on target and everything. So I think that it falls on the auditor to make sure that they communicate with the client and kind of start the process and get things going. Because, I had an instance where, the auditor told us, use our Dropbox, upload everything. So I'm like, okay, I'm uploading everything. And then I get an email, you haven't given us anything. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And I look in and it's because they wanted me to update their doc request list too, but they didn't communicate that to me. So then I had to go through and say, actually, I emailed this on this day. I uploaded this on this day. And it was that lack of communication of who is taking the lead that I think caused extra, 10 extra emails that we had to go through. So I do think it falls on the auditor to control the process.
Okay.
You can go to the next.
Before we go to the next slide, I'm going to put up one more poll. And when do you anticipate having 100% people back? So if, okay, there we go. People are finally responding. We don't have any questions yet. I mean, Kristen did give some comments on hair and eyeliner, but I don't know if that relates to the audit. We're going to talk about physical inventories later on, correct?
Yep.
Is Aurora or Tara, are you going to mention physical inventories?
Yeah, we will.
Okay, good. We're at 70%. Come on, let's push it over the hump. Get you the CPE credits. I'm going to start doing these like the military. If we don't get to 90%, nobody gets credit. So then I get the other people harassing them. All right, we're almost at a minute. I'm going to close it out. And so you will see that 20% said they never left, 24% say October 1st, 22% say January 1st, and 34% say possibly never. Look at that. So that's interesting. Over a third of the people say they may never go back to 100%. That's interesting. Okay.
Okay, so this takes us back to the next phase of the audit, which is audit field work. We'll call it field work, but it's really comprised mostly of document review, right? And usually we do this in-house at the clients, but that is not really how it's taken part in this atmosphere today. We're really doing most of this remotely. And so I think there's certain considerations that we should be thinking about. The time for preparing and uploading documentation should be taken into account. And what I mean there is that it's taking the client staff longer to address the requests. Instead of just handing something over or walking into the audit conference room and saying, hey, here's the file, take what you need. They now need to go through that file and pick out what they think is the pertinent information for the auditor, scan it, copy it, upload it. So I think people have to consider that that's going to be a more time-consuming process than it was in the past. Which brings us to the second point, which is communication regarding what documentation is necessary should be clear to avoid unnecessary back and forth. And I think this is a really important point because often the message or the documentation sent is not the message or documentation received. So to avoid issues in that area, specificity in terms of what your request is really important. If you want to, per se, where in the past we might say, hey, I'd like support for these disbursements. Now it's important to say the support should include the invoice that shows an approval and a canceled check so that you're not getting the wrong information and having to go back and forth 3 or 4 times. So I think the suggestions for success here probably are pick up the phone. It doesn't always have to be an email transmission. A lot of times you can just pick up the phone and you can settle whatever differences there are on the phone. Also, all of these.
What is that you said?
The telephone.
Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of young people on here, I don't think. Do we get them in here so you could tell them? Because they're usually the ones that just keep sending the email, right?
Yes, I watch them go back and forth all the time. Yes, very interesting.
Yes.
And also all of these, and so what they do like with the younger people is they like that all of these, this Google, all these platforms really do have a way for you to share your screen. So that's really helpful. If a client is confused or you want to be very clear on exactly what it is that you want them to give you, share your screen. Hey, this is what you gave us last year. This is what works. These are the 5 attributes that I need to solidify what piece of your documentation is going to help me do this. A little bit of really good communication goes a long way, as opposed to, again, watching the volley of emails go back and forth. I gave you that, you didn't give me that. It's just easier sometimes to just nip it in the bud and talk to a person and get clear on what it is that you need. Another consideration, and I haven't done this recently, but I have done it in my past life, is to consider, can you give direct access to certain modules within your software to the auditors? For example, if you're using Great Plains or Blackboard, is it possible for you to allow the auditor to have permission to go up and say, look at your GL in read-only mode, go up and look at your payroll registers, those items that are kind of voluminous, and where we know kind of more what we're looking for maybe than what the client would know. Sometimes it's easier if we can just go in and get it ourselves. It's just something to consider just for efficiency's sake. And lastly, I think that it's very important to address how the questions regarding the data be communicated. So what I mean by that is, always there's a second ask, right? The auditor asks the client for something, an AP aging, and then there's a second ask. Or they ask for the receivable subsequent receipts, and then there's something else, a question. How come this didn't get received? How come only part of this got received? Different questions concerning that original set of data. I think it's important to decide how those are going to be handled, because in the past it was basically somebody from the client would walk in at the end of the day, say, how did you do? Or the auditor would walk into the ED's office or the controller's office at the end of the day and say, hey, listen, we did good today. We got through fixed assets, except we have a couple questions. For inventory, we're waiting for Joe from the warehouse to get back to us. You just don't have that same ability, in-person connection at this point. And this is where I've seen back and forth, and just even watching it can be really, really frustrating. So I think if you can come up with a plan for, hey, twice a week, we're going to check in, we're going to tell you our progress, we're going to tell you what we're still missing, we'll show you what it is that we need, and that'll keep us all on track. I just think those planned, definite meetings, meetings of the mind, whether you want to do it once a day, you want to do it twice a week, you want to do it on Fridays, I just think that's a really important part of getting through the audit in an efficient way. Aurora, do you have any suggestions for how to facilitate those questions coming out of both areas, from the client and then from the auditor side?
Sure. I definitely think what you said, the check-ins are critical. You know, checking in on the document requested list. Did we give everything that we needed over in the format that the auditor wanted? It's really critical. What you said about giving access, if people use QuickBooks Online, that's one of the easiest softwares to give access to your accountant. And what we do on the outsourcing side is we normally attach documents to every transaction. So when it's time for the audit at the end of the year, we give the auditor access and basically say, like, don't ask me anything unless you can't figure it out. So it makes it a lot easier on the client side instead of having to pull everything individually. Brad, you're making a face.
Your auditors. So that's interesting, because somebody actually had a question and they said, so should we be recommending, or not we recommend to clients, or should clients consider moving to a scanned document management for their accounting process?
Yeah, I think it's easier because then they can just give us access. I know clients who use things like HubDocs. We can go in there and then see all the statements that they have in there. So it definitely makes it easier if it's something that you could just give access. Payroll, we get access to, so then we can just look at everything read-only. Bank accounts, we can get read-only access. I think the more we have, like Tara said, we know what to do with it as an auditor. So we ask less questions to the client versus if we're asking them for things and they don't know the purpose behind it. So I think the more we can help each other, help ourselves.
You know, I don't know, I think it came out in the late 80s. Michael Crichton wrote a book and Tom Cruise starred in the movie where everything was virtual. And I remember seeing the movie and Tom Cruise is going like this, pulling stuff out of the air, looking at papers virtually. That was the 80s. And we still haven't gotten there yet, where people are like, it's all paper. It's all paper. But it's available to us. They can scan everything as part of their accounting process. And even yesterday, our IT guy sent me something that he needed me to check off and send back. I didn't feel like saving it down to my desktop, finding it, copying it. I just printed it, marked it up, and gave it back to him. I guess as Chris said, I'm a boomer. Somebody asked a tough question. I hope that they weren't going to ask. But he's a great person. He always attends these, and is a very good client. But he asked the question: shouldn't audit fees be lower if we're scanning everything for you?
No.
Oh, your audio's out. Sorry, Ken, can't answer.
Well, this virtual environment has definitely not made it easier on the auditors, just to put it that way. We have a lot more things. In fact, even from regulatory agencies where we follow our auditing standards from, are saying that the audit cannot be less than what it used to be. In fact, there has to be more scrutiny. There has to be more scrutiny in terms of documentation when we are seeing copies or are seeing scans. So the onus and the risk on the auditors is actually heightened because of this remote atmosphere, as opposed to being less risky. And the work just is, again, then we're doing the work of what, if we're picking through files, we're sort of doing what the client was doing. So I would say it's not a justification to lower the fees. I don't know if it's a justification to hire them either, but I think that we're definitely not seeing less work on our side.
I know the one area where we could possibly save money is on travel.
Yes.
Okay.
I'll get the travel.
Yeah. I'd say if someone is looking for an area where they could help reduce some of their audit fees, I think it's less in the virtual remote auditing, but more clients could, if they have someone on staff, prepare their own financial statements or outsource it to someone who prepares their financial statements and then gives it to the auditor. and the fee of possibly outsourcing it to someone else and then giving it to your auditor, that could save some time. I'd say that's probably really the only savings, because there is time that goes into the auditor having to put those statements together. And it would help you from an entity perspective because you're enhancing your internal controls. You're not going to have that, internal control deficiency that the client's not capable of preparing their own financial statements. So I think a way to kind of step up your game and get some savings would be to think about doing some of those things that you can be doing in other ways.
Great.
So another part of the audit that can sometimes be challenging is the interviews that we need to conduct. We have to talk to a number of people throughout the organization at different levels, and we ask them differing questions. We're looking for different information from them. There's a certain amount that we have to do in order to fulfill our standards. It's similar to in-person, and actually on a regular audit, some of the interviews are handled remotely anyway. Generally, interviews with board members, sometimes with the executive director or the CFO or the CEO if they're not on site. So it's not new in terms of the interviews to be handling some of them remotely. It is similar to in-person, but what I would say in an in-person or a remote interview, I think it's really important that the auditor should come prepared with their questions so that when they get the person that they need to speak to, not only is their time valuable, but it's important to be pointed in what information you actually want to garner from them. So I think it's important to have a list of questions, take notes, be responsive. I think another important tenet is if you can make it a live video, I think that's more important because body language says a lot to the auditor, not only in terms of, fraud or that kind of thing, but also just in terms of being conversational. It's easier to see when you pique someone's interest, when you can actually see how they respond to something, as opposed to hearing a yes or a no on the other side of the phone. So I do think that whenever possible, they should take a live version on the interview.
And Tara, the AICPA, I sat through a webinar last week on remote auditing or auditing during the COVID environment. And that's one of the things that they absolutely stressed is that especially during fraud interviews, you need to be visual because you want to see their reactions and stuff. Mm-hmm. And I can understand, I'm a ham, so I don't mind being on camera, but a lot of people don't like to be. I don't understand because I don't know if they realize that when we're talking in person, I could see them.
Right. Yeah.
But they just kind of hide.
So, Aurora,
I cut you off.
Have you had any experiences with remote interviews, either good or bad?
Sure. I mean, one thing that I would say is to have available more than one way to do a video conference. Because for example, I'll send some people a Teams invite and they don't know how to use Teams or they can't figure out how to download it. So I normally will have Teams, Google, and Zoom available, and I'll let people pick what they're most comfortable and used to using. I find if someone has a problem with Teams or with Zoom, that Google is usually the fastest to start a meeting and be able to send a link over immediately and get them to join in. So I would say just talk about what people are comfortable with, because sometimes when you use Teams internally, but then you send it to a client, they don't know how to use it. So I have options.
So that's a great tip because I wouldn't have thought about that. Have a couple of mediums available for them. That's great. That's a good tip. So with this,
that's an excellent tip because we at Sovelco, we've been all of a sudden attuned to Teams. We've only had it for 6 months, and we think that's the only and best thing out there. Meanwhile, Chris yesterday and I sent a Teams request to a client that we've had a meeting with already on Teams, and they're saying we can't get on. And Chris and I are like, all right, we're gonna go to a conference call automatically. We're going to a conference call. Meanwhile, the client had already sent us within 15 seconds, sent us a Google Meetup request. And so there's Teams, there's Zoom, there's Google, and I'm sure I'm missing a ton more that are available to us.
Absolutely.
Okay. Great.
So with this, I'm going to hand the presentation to Aurora to go a little bit more deeply into some of the technical issues involved in the remote audit.
And before she does that, I'm going to put out another poll. See, I'm the type of guy that likes to ruin the party. Oh, we're having fun. Oh, let's have another poll. Do you have the technology for the remote audit? That's the question. And Kate on the screen, one of the attendees said possibly even just FaceTime. That's true. You know, something as simple as that, except if they don't have iPhones. So let's see. Do you have the technology? Right now, we're at 67% already. Wow, the military thing helped out, pushed them fast. I like that. You know, somebody said yes, but what does the audit firm require? That's a great question, Ken. And I think in reality, we've got to start moving towards what the masses have. As I said, we were on a call yesterday and we wanted them to use Teams, and it was my first time ever using Google, and it worked great. I thought actually Google was the best so far over Zoom and Teams. So I'm going to close the poll. 90% say they have the technology, 7% say no, but they're working on it, and then I'll share it, and 2% say that they don't ever anticipate doing getting the technology. So that's interesting. But it's, you see 90%. I'm impressed that 90% of the people have the technology already. That's great to hear. All right, technical considerations. Here you go.
All right, now the fun stuff.
Well, it's
So
only
for us, the auditing,
only 3% and 7% don't have it. So you want to just go to the next slide?
yeah, that's true. Yeah,
Okay.
we're good. Well, so as far as the auditing standards go, our requirements as auditors are we need to get certain kinds of evidence. We don't have to be directed to how we obtain that evidence. So some of the things in the remote environment that we can consider is electronic confirmations are permissible by our professional standards. So a lot of times, I'm sure as auditors we use confirmation.com, and then also it is possible to email a confirmation and then get it back that way. Some examples of some scope limitations, and this goes back to someone's questions about inventory observations. So if we didn't have the ability to physically go and observe the inventory count, what are some other options for us and what could we do? So there's a few options, and we talk about this internally and how's it going to work. So if your warehouse is stored at a public warehouse, you can actually send confirmations. And if that's the case, I would contact your warehouse now if your year end is 12/31 and just ask if they even respond to confirmations and see if you can get an example of what an auditor would get back from a confirmation request. Send it to your auditor and say, hey, is this enough? In case, hopefully not, but in case something happened and we went into a serious lockdown again. Another thing that you could do is you could do the observation a little bit earlier or a little bit later than your year end. This can increase some of the time the auditors have to spend testing a rollback or a roll forward, but that is another option as well. They talk about, can you do like a live video and watch the observation taking place? And my recommendation would be, as long as you can provide the auditor with proof that it is actually a live video. I'm not saying like hold up a newspaper, but they need something to know that it's actually taking place on that date and that it is actually live and in person. So there is a few options there. When it comes to evaluating internal controls, as auditors, we have to do walkthroughs. So using some of the technology, we can actually say, hey, share your screen and let me watch you post that transaction. And actually, watch someone doing it that way. So that's another way to try to avoid any scope limitations in the remote environment. Some considerations when it comes to the management representation letter is that for professional standards, we can accept an electronic signature, but we just have to verify that the person who is supposed to sign is the person who actually signed. One thing that I really like using is DocuSign, because you can upload a PDF. So normally I ask the client, hey, put it on your letterhead. I upload it into DocuSign, and then I actually email it out to because we need 2 signatures on it, and I email it out to the 2 people who have to sign. And until both people sign, I can keep sending reminders to whoever may not have signed that, hey, we're still waiting on you to sign this rep letter. And when you get it back in DocuSign, you see that they've signed it. And what I do too is I also CC, the staff on it and just say, let them get a copy when it's fully executed. So then I don't need to remember to forward to the staff, hey, I got the rep letter back. You can finish everything. They're getting notified in real time. So I really like some of the technology that we're able to start using, and it's kind of adding some efficiency for us and some of the processes that would kind of drag out wrapping up the audit and everything like that.
Hey, Aurora, about those last two items at the AICPA, I heard the AICPA talk twice on remote audits. And the first time they said no electronic signatures. And then the second time they said, all right. And that was back in like April. And then now in July, they're like, okay, all right, we could probably do electronic signatures. But how do you know it's really that person that's signing? And I don't know. And I like the presenter, Bob Doerr. He's a great guy. But I wanted to say to him, if I send a piece of paper over and somebody signs like this, how do I know it's actually that person too? Nobody's sitting there comparing signatures. So, and it's a little bit crazy to say that that's the reason you shouldn't. They also said that, it should be on client letterhead, nice and glossy, just typing the client name and address. They really don't like that. That's what they said. They couldn't give a reason why, except we really don't like it. So,
I mean, most clients, they have electronic letterhead. So even if they don't know how to do it, I'll be like, okay, give it to me and I'll stick it on there for you. And then I put it in the DocuSign. So I think DocuSign does give you a trail, because as soon as someone opens something, you get a notification that they viewed it. And as soon as they did whatever you asked them to do, whether it be sign or initial, you get a notification that they did it. So there is an electronic trail, and you can verify that it's that person that way. So I do think that this has opened up the world to better ways to communicate, and kind of sometimes more efficient ways to communicate as well.
Great.
Tara, what would you say in terms of if you've had success maybe with walkthroughs or the confirmation process, what's been working for you?
Okay, so whatever kind of audit, whether it's an in-person audit or a remote audit, I'm always a big fan of confirmation, right? Because it's a third party, it's the most reliable source, and I feel like it takes a lot of the burden of the vouching and the finding files off of both the auditor and the client. So that's always my first way to go. I think we're doing it more now just because it does give us a certain level of comfort when you don't have original documents. So I do think that it's an important tool to be using. And I've had a lot of success with it. I have success on a lot of my jobs, even with confirming government grants, and something that we are using more now that it's become more remote. So I'm a big fan of the confirmations. For the internal controls, I think what is really important to point out is that we have to understand that clients' internal controls are probably not the same as last year, because a lot of things have changed. They have less people sometimes working in the office, sometimes where they had maybe a signature for an approval on something, they may have actually an email. So I think it's important first to understand what's changed, and not just assume that the controls are operating as they were. And then for the walkthrough, because most of them cannot be done on site, we are having a lot of success doing them via screen sharing. So once the auditor does understand what the process is, sit down, have an interview with the actual process owner and walk through those transactions like you would as if you were at the client. And I think that's really the best way to do it. And I think then there's no scope limitation. You're doing it the same way, just virtually, really.
Thanks, Sarah. I mean, one thing, talking about what you're saying about controls and getting an understanding, I've actually seen some digression in controls in this remote environment. Like, I have one client where they gave the AP person their signature stamp and let them take it home. And I said, oh no. I'm like, first of all, I want to throw the signature stamp in the garbage. And then second, you can't give someone your signature stamp and let them take it home and let them take a pile of checks home with them too. I'm like, that's not acceptable. And and they were both going into the office, but on separate days. So I said, how about when the AP clerk prints the checks, she leaves them for you. And then, when you come in, you physically sign them, and then, have an office admin mail them out. And they just didn't think about, okay, let's change the process and still keep the controls intact. They just thought, we're in this remote environment, okay, yeah, take my stamp, no big deal. And I'm like, no, you just broke down your whole process. So I think it's definitely something, having the conversation, make sure there's no, going back.
Yeah, and I do think that's something we do have to be aware of, because I do think, especially when it first hit, and we all thought that it was going to be very temporary, people did tend to just leave the offices and sort of not think about the processes. So I think there is an added burden on the auditor's part to try and understand what controls were put in place for now this 4-month period of time.
So you mentioned the inventory, and I don't know if you're going to discuss it anymore later on, but I wanted to just go back and emphasize that. I anticipate, for the most part, we're going to be having people on premises to do the inventory. Because while you can hold the newspaper up like this, you know, showing the date and everything, and or you can take the camera for me and go around like this, even if it's live, that's great. How do I know what's behind you, though? And that's one of the essences of the physical inventories. They're supposed to be looking all around. Even though we're counting this item here, we're supposed to be looking at everything around. And unless we're going to send in a drone or a robot to go around and see it for us, I anticipate, and we've already started talking about this internally, I anticipate we're going to have people on premises doing inventories. And for that reason, in case we go back into lockdown, we've said amongst our audit managers and partners, we have to start considering doing inventories, especially cycle counts now, in case we get back into lockdown again. So.
Yeah, I had one June 30th inventory observation, and before we went out there, first of all, I confirmed with the staff that they're comfortable with going and they were okay with going. So we go out there and I confirmed with the client what their process was like, and is everyone going to be wearing masks, and could they put us somewhere where we're segregated, you know, and we could still social distance and do the observation. So that's kind of what we did. And I mean, it's not a complete lockdown right now, but it worked, and you know, I felt comfortable and I felt safe, and the client felt comfortable and safe, and we were able to actually observe it in person.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
All right, next slide. All right, so, you know, this brings us to our conclusion, and, you know, some of the things, you know, it's be responsive, and it goes both ways on the client side and the auditor side. You know, everyone's working in a new environment, so we're all figuring things out together. So I think it's important that as the auditor, you check in with the client and let them know if you're having issues in a timely manner. And I think as a client, if, you know, some of these requests that are coming through remotely, if there's any confusion, please, you know, go back to the auditor and ask. And that's why I think check-ins kind of help. And if it's regularly scheduled, you can kind of make sure that you're getting the information like you would if you could just walk into someone's office and ask them a question. I think a timetable is really critical. You know, set a timetable for when you're going to have everything uploaded, when you need the financial statements in by. You know, if you have a deadline that's regulated, it makes it easier. But I think that just making sure, like the auditors where I am the outsourced CFO, they said basically if we can't get everything by the end of July, we're not going to be able to give you a draft by the end of August. You know, and so I have a realistic deadline in my head of when I needed to get everything to them to make sure that we can meet the board's, you know, requirements. So I think that's something that is really important. If you want to go to the next slide. So we created this, you know, graphic to kind of give you guys an overview of what a traditional audit looked like and kind of what we're used to, you know, when it goes from scheduling the audit, and then the auditors come in and they perform planning and field work, and then they wrap up the audit. That's when we can do things the way that it was before. Now I think in a remote environment, it's going to take, you know, scheduling an audit timeline and, you know, putting dates out like, okay, we're going to, you know, upload it by this, you're going to do this by this, and we're going to wrap it up by this date. I think test the communication technology. Make sure that you can actually talk to each other on a video call. Have options like we talked about before. Plan a secure data exchange. Figure out what works best for everyone to get the data the way we need it. I know a lot of clients use Dropbox, and you know, I think Dropbox is pretty useful. As you know, Sobel, we can provide portals to clients so they can upload things securely. So I think it's just figuring out how we're going to get the data to each other. I think emails with a bunch of attachments, that tends to be less efficient, because if you're only sending it to one person, how do they get it to the team? So I think having a place where things can get collected and exchanged in a more organized manner really helps. And then we can go into performing, planning, field work, and, you know, wrapping up the audit. And I think that it's just the upfront work will make sure that the whole process is going to work. If not, we're going to run into it where we don't meet deadlines and we can't finish things because we're still scrambling and, we didn't get the right information, but we didn't explain it to someone correctly. So I think that's kind of my summary of everything. And then Tara, is there anything you want to add to concluding this?
Yes, I think just to reiterate what you're saying, and that's what communication is key. We have so many ways to do it now, like in terms of, like we talked about, all the different ways that you can share screens. You have telephones, you have all these portals, all these organizational tools. So I think we just need to use them more than we have in the past. I think communication is key about everything, and I think that's the largest takeaway from this.
Courtney has a great question. It's very open-ended, okay? What's the most common mistakes you're seeing now?
In terms of like the proof that, like, the backup we're getting for everything?
She didn't give specific areas, so you can answer anything you want. Like, my wife does this all the time. I'm gonna probably go with that one. So what I see is, and actually you mentioned, you lean towards it about portal or Excel. What I see is that firms, and we've switched just recently, but we're still switching over, are still under that Excel PBC, document request checklist, and we send that over. And there are a lot of tools available to firms, and we've started using now, where it maintains a list of prioritizes documents when it's needed, and when the client uploads it, it checks it off that it's done, and the auditor gets an email notification. The auditor can look at it. If they accept it, they mark that it's accepted. If it's the wrong document, they can return it, and there's a trail back and forth. And before, you said that you weren't told the stuff was uploaded, because you didn't update something. So not moving and using new technology is what I think is one of the biggest mistakes. So I tried to give you guys time to think of something.
Thanks, Brad. No, I think I agree with you. I think it's just, some of the backup that we're getting in terms of where there could be errors. I mean, sometimes it was that way before. People should make sure when you upload a schedule, it ties to the trial balance, and make sure that everything actually agrees to all the information that you've given, because I think in this remote environment, it is a lot harder to say, hey, give us a schedule, but it doesn't agree, and just have that conversation. So I think to avoid, again, the back and forth, make sure that what you're giving matches everything else that you've provided. And I think also providing communication like via email. So if we have to send electronic confirmations, instead of just normally we'd ask for the name and the address, now we're asking for name, address, and emails. So sometimes the clients don't even have an email contact. And, I've seen confirmations go out where it's like the person responds, I'm not responsible for this. So making sure that we have the right email contact for someone. I'm sure when it was traditional mail, the confirmation would get there. And if it was sent to the wrong person, they just go give it to the right person. And now I get that back where it's like, oh no, I don't handle this. And we need to go back to the client and figure out, okay, actually, who's the right contact we need to send this to? So I think that's another area where we have some errors.
Tara?
So I'm not sure exactly, but if Courtney was looking for where are we seeing errors at the client's place of business, or just
mistake, like how it's not working, the remote audit environment.
So I think it's just for as auditors, I think we have to just see what controls what happened during that time when people were gone. And I do think that that's where a lot of clients did let things fall apart on their end, because I think just like we as a firm, kind of everybody ran out and left everything. I think that's really what I'm seeing, is that's an important place to focus some time and make sure that if controls were not put back to where they should have been, that they should be now, since this is not really a temporary situation.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate. So for the audits of 2019, calendar 19, okay. I feel bad for a lot of the 630 nonprofits, because it was right at their end of their year end that everybody ran off the ship and just left things and took their sign stamp and went home type of thing. I think that that's where the trouble is going to come up, and that's one of the things where the AICPA is telling us to focus on internal controls and the breakdown of internal controls. So Tara, you do a lot of nonprofits, and I know you have 630 year ends, and I could venture some of the nonprofits, I'm not picking on bigger, smaller, all companies to some extent, their internal controls broke down. So we might want to caution that there might be internal control comments, and it may increase our testing. Going back to Ken's comment earlier, how is this going to reduce the audit? Well, if controls broke down and they weren't operating during the year like they should have, may increase our testing, unfortunately. I'm always the one at the end of these things that gives like the worst comment, like Debbie Downer. Wah, 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 wah. Okay, let's go home. Somebody else said, asked the question. I think they it looks like they asked it twice. So I'm going to read the shorter one. How do you handle clients who have to relocate from their office space now?
In terms
So
of getting,
I'm assuming that they can't get everything scanned and sent over.
yeah. So, I mean, I have some clients who have said to me like, well, if we don't have what you need electronically, can you just pick another one? And I say no. So that's one thing that I think, people need to
That's a great one.
understand. Like if we don't have it scanned, and I'm like, no. So I think we're coordinating with them, and I think that's where the upfront conversations need to happen before you're actually scheduled to work on it. And just say, where are all the documents? Can we go in and look at anything, even if it's just going in and grabbing a box and leaving? And are the clients okay with us taking documents? So I think it's just, how are we going to get the information?
Yeah, and thank you for saying that, Aurora. I mean, we do have clients that are willing to allow us to take documents. Anthony in our office said he gave a client 60 selections. They gave him 20, and he went back to home to work on them. He didn't make them work in the car in the parking lot. They went back, got 20 more. Now it wasn't 21 pieces of paper. It was 20 files that they had to go through. Because the client didn't want to give up all 60 at once in case something happened. So there are ways to work around it. We don't want to have people saying, oh, it's just too much for me to copy 10 pages type of thing. I know Chris in her office has a client that has files that are this thick, and she has to select a handful of them. Well, we're not going to expect the client to scan a file this thick when we only want one piece of paper out of it. That'd be crazy. We're trying to work with you as much as possible too. But we also have clients that it's sensitive data. They don't want to give out the documents electronically. They don't want to hand out the documents and let it out of their office. So we have to find a way to work with that too.
I just want to say, Fred, I actually have a team member working in a parking lot on 2 files today because they got all the files except for 2. And we just couldn't work out how to get in there, and it's like a half an hour worth of work. And so she said, I don't mind doing it in my car. So that's actually happening right now.
Did you at least crack the windows for them?
I told her to crack the windows.
Okay, good. They are younger staff. You have to remind them, okay? We've got one more poll to put up because I know some people want to get their credits, and then we're going to go to closing comments. What is the most difficult? What is the most difficult in working remotely? So this is the one that usually takes the longest. I'm trying to see if we have any other questions. I have a client that wants to sit in my car and go through the files, and I refuse. Yeah, that's kind of weird. Yeah, no, I probably at this point, and listen, I'm ready to fly. I'm ready to do stuff, so I'm not really sensitive. But somebody said to me one day, "Oh, I'll take a ride with you when we go pick up the dinner." And I'm like, "Yeah, no, I can go myself." All of a sudden, and that was my wife, by the way. No kidding. It seems that people are not as much comfortable sitting in the car. So I couldn't imagine sitting in the car with the client as you're looking through it. Plus, I think that's going to look like some sort of shady deal going down. So of the question, I'll close it. I will share the poll, which says, what's the most difficulty? 43% said lack of personal connection. And the other big one, 45% said all of the above. So you see that 5% said constant emails, 7% said too many video chats. So it's very interesting. So at that point, we are at the conclusion of the slides. We're right at 9:30. You guys are unbelievable. Right at 9:30. I mean, Chris last week went 15 minutes over. You guys are incredible. Perfect timing. I don't see any other questions. Do you have any final comments? I'll go to Aurora first.
I just want to thank everyone for participating. And the reason why we're finishing on time is because we really nailed down being in this remote environment. So thank you, everyone.
Oh that's impressive. That's impressive. Good. That's a good sales job. Sally right now is salivating. She's like, yes, yes.
All right, Tara, anything from you?
Thank you. Thanks for your participation. I've learned a lot, so I hope everybody else has as well.
Okay. I want to thank everybody for attending. We are looking to have another session, maybe not next week, it might be the following week, going back to the PPP, possibly, maybe taxation. You know, for those that are still on, if you have any ideas on topics of what you're interested in hearing, because I guarantee what interests me probably doesn't interest you necessarily. Please put them in a comment somewhere on your responses. We aim to try and put on sessions that are of interest to people where they're going to get as much information out of. And of course, we're going to look at the masses of the people that say what they're looking for. And with that is 9:31. I want to thank everybody for attending. I want to thank Aurora and Tara for pulling the presentation together and providing the information. If anybody has any question, their information's on the screen and they're also on our website. And we will conclude the session. Thank you very much.